Everybody, welcome to my presentation on Paulo Freire and the pedagogy of the oppressed. If you remember, I asked you to read chapter 2 of the pedagogy of the oppressed during your induction week. And the reason why we focused on this particular piece of writing first is it's to give you the idea that you're leaving school and college behind, and in coming to university you're going to experience, hopefully, a new way of learning in which the learning is collaborative, where we co-create knowledge, and where you take responsibility for your own learning and for your own personal, professional and academic development. And this is what Paulo Freire is talking about, that we need to become critical citizens rather than the passive recipients of knowledge. I'm also using the pedagogy of the oppressed to introduce to you the idea of different levels of critical thinking and the different academic skills that they involve. So we'll be using this chapter to demonstrate what different skills you'll need here at university. So the aim of this presentation then is to first of all define and then apply a range of academic skills by first of all describing and then critically evaluating chapter 2 of the pedagogy of the oppressed. So the main aim of this presentation then, the thing that I want you to take away from it the most, is that there is a difference between a descriptive way of writing, in which you're simply presenting information, and a more critical way of writing and thinking, which involves evaluating the ideas. How are we going to achieve that? What are our objectives? Well, first of all, I'm going to explain to you what we mean by describe. I'm then going to talk about what analysis involves. We're then going to move on to evaluate, and finally we'll apply. So we're going to practice these different skills throughout the session. And then at the end of it, I want to show you how I have referenced the work of Paulo Freire, because referencing is going to be an important skill that you're going to learn in this module. We can think of the critical skills that I'm describing as appropriate to different levels of study. So in this first semester of your first year, you'll be expected to describe some of the articles, books, book chapters and ideas that you're reading. That is a level 4 skill, the ability to accurately describe or outline or summarize information. But as you move into semester 2 and into the second year, description alone won't be enough to pass your assignments. You'll need to do more, particularly if you want to score good marks. So we'll be expecting you to analyze, to critically dissect and pull apart ideas, see whether the conclusions an author draws are justified by the evidence that the author has presented. In the second year and in the third year, you'll be expecting to critically evaluate. So these are level 5 and level 6 skills. And critically evaluate means examine the strengths and weaknesses of a book chapter or a set of ideas or an argument. And then finally, towards the end of your third year and then at postgraduate study, we'll want you to critically synthesize, which means draw in different arguments, different ideas from a range of authors and put them together in your own argument, so that you're presenting an argument that critically synthesizes, collects, brings together, weaves together and knits the ideas of other writers. So you are putting forward your own argument that's informed and evidenced by the arguments of others. And these skills get more difficult as you go along, and you'll see this in today's class. Many of you will be very comfortable describing and outlining the ideas of Freire, but we'll probably need to work together as a group to analyse and critically evaluate those ideas. So the first exercise I'm asking you to do then, having read the Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is use your notes just to identify the key points in the chapter. Now, this is a key skill that I want you to learn. When you read a book or a book chapter, I don't want you to copy over into your notebook huge paragraphs of text. It's much better if you can summarize those ideas and draw out the key points. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, it avoids any allegations of plagiarism later on, which is where when you pass other people's ideas as your own. Secondly, it allows you to capture the essential core meaning of an author. And that's an important thing to be able to do, to be able to differentiate what's secondary and ephemeral from what's important and primary in what an author's saying. And the final thing is that it will allow you to create a framework around which you can build your own ideas. So you can flesh out the key points by thinking about your own experience and your own examples and maybe linking to other people's theories. So it becomes a tool for connecting to wider theory and wider knowledge. So that's the first exercise. List the key points, and we're aiming for 4 or 5. If we have 20 key points, probably they're not all key points, and we end up just reproducing the entire chapter. The key points that I took out of the chapter, and which through class discussion it seemed that you had seen as well, was that Freire presents what he calls the banking model of education, where students and pupils are really the passive recipients of knowledge that teachers have determined, transmitted, and assessed. So the teacher, as the so-called expert at the front of the class, is the one who's determining what counts as knowledge, what's important to know, and then transmitting that in a jug and mug approach so that students passively taking it on board without questioning it, and then they get measured on how well they understand that knowledge. This banking model of education prevents students from developing their own critical thinking. And it means that when a student comes across a novel or a new situation that requires some critical thinking and creative thinking, that's difficult because learning by rote doesn't create the problem-solving skills that we need in a modern democracy in order to hold politicians to account. And I think that's what Freire's underlying point is, that the type of education that we have creates a passive citizenship that's unable to challenge through critical thinking, research, and evidence the ideas imposed on us by politicians. An alternative model of education is advocated by Freire. He wants to see learning that is collaborative, where the knowledge is co-created, so it's relevant to the students who are learning it, and where the problem-solving skills that students learn enable them to work creatively with novel problems and holds politicians to account through active citizenship. This model of education promotes individual autonomy. It creates lifelong learners, people who don't just passively consume education, but are actually the creators of education and decide themselves what's important to know and learn. And there's been a real flourishing in this kind of education, and the internet is partly responsible for this, because everybody from their own home can access all kinds of online free courses which they happen to be interested in. And there are communities of learning out there which Freire could not have dreamed of. The next exercise was to have you summarize those key points into a paragraph. And again, this is a key skill that I want you to learn. You have a list of the key points, and you're now turning that list into a summary using your own words. And that summary, that paragraph, could easily be slotted into an assignment. So this is about summarizing and paraphrasing an authored ideas so that they can be presented in an assignment in a integrated and critical way. Here's my summary. Freire, 1993, argues that the traditional form of teaching, in which the student is the passive recipient of knowledge from an expert teacher, is a form of oppression. He argues that traditional teaching supports power inequalities in society by emphasizing the expertise of the teacher and their role in determining what students must learn. Freire proposes a more collaborative pedagogy in which decisions about learning are shared and knowledge is co-created. This approach, he argues, promotes critical thinking and social liberation. Notice the date after Freire's name. That's what's called an in-text reference, and you'll be learning about that. The full bibliographical details, which will tell me where that information has come from, are going to be in the reference list at the end of your essays. But notice I've kind of, in a brief paragraph, written about the essence of what Freire is talking about. That could be easily expanded, paragraph after paragraph, going into more detail. But that is what we call a big chunk version of Freire's ideas. And you could see how that might be slotted into an essay, along with other paragraphs, in order to put together an argument. The next thing I asked you to do was to watch a video on YouTube which explained what critical thinking involves. And that's because I wanted to make a distinction between the exercises we've just done, in which you are essentially describing the ideas of an author, and I wanted to distinguish that between that and what we're going to do next, which is to think more critically about what the author's saying. I want you to move from merely describing things to actually analysing and critically evaluating them. Exercise 4 asked you to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses in Paulo Freire's argument. So again, we've moved away from just describing, and now we're having to actually engage with the text so that we can discover for ourselves what is good and what is bad about it. We had a discussion about the strengths and weaknesses, and we came up with some great ideas. You proved to me that you can indeed critically analyse and evaluate a text. The strengths of the article, of the book chapter, was that the theory did indeed match a lot of our experiences in education. And it seemed to be that the younger we are, the more we experience the banking model of education. But some of you said as well that by the time you got to college, that was less emphasis on the jug and mug approach, and there was much more discussion and collaboration in the classroom. The other thing that I've added later, through thinking about it a little bit more, is that Freire's ideas aren't particularly new. He builds on the ideas of a French philosopher called Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who argued that we weren't blank slates, that we actually have already experiences that we can reflect on and that we can actively participate in our own learning. And this was something that the American philosopher John Dewey also said. He talked about experiential education. Again, that students mustn't be the passive recipients of knowledge. Rather, they must experience for themselves learning and apply it to their own experience and integrate it in their own experience. And this is something that we'll be encouraging on the program. It's a little bit like going for a meal, and the difference between reading the menu, which is very theoretical and gives you no idea what the flavors of the food might be like, and actually tasting the food and actually cooking the food for yourself. So you can see the difference there, that when you're actually in the kitchen with sweat pouring down your face and an omelette burning in the pan, you're actually fully participating in that learning. You're not simply the recipient of a description or a menu, which gives you no idea what the food might be like. The weaknesses, though, were quite significant, and you demonstrated some good critical skills by picking out the problems with Freire's thesis. It could be dated, teaching methods have evolved, and it seems students are much more active learners now, particularly at college. It could be that the theory is rooted in its history and its culture, that it's specific to Brazil in the 1970s and doesn't particularly apply to a modern 21st century culture like our own. But most critical of all, I think, is that Freire is making unsubstantiated claims. There's no evidence in support of what he's arguing, and particularly there's no empirical evidence. And by empirical evidence, we mean research that's been done in the real world with real people that's generated evidence in support of Freire's arguments. So we can now apply Freire's thinking to the counselling and psychotherapy context, but we do so much more critically, much more aware that actually, as far as we're concerned, Freire hasn't quite proven his case yet, and that we must apply his ideas tentatively, because it might be there's a lot of compelling evidence and arguments against what Freire is saying. So in exercise 5, I asked you to work in pairs and apply the ideas of Freire to the counselling and psychotherapy situation, to a different context. And again, this is a different skill that I'd like you to develop on the programme, that you're not only reading and critically thinking about people's work, but you're applying those ideas to different contexts and to the world of counselling and psychotherapy as well. So, could we come up with a psychotherapy of the oppressed? Well, I think we can group uh, Paulo Freire's thinking into two main areas. So it's that actually um, the, the counselling and psychotherapy that puts the therapist in charge of the process, where the therapist is the expert who is diagnosing and treating the patient, does resemble the traditional banking model that Freire talks about when he talks about education. And similarly, the humanistic approach, which is one we're going to learn, is much more co-created and creative. It promotes client autonomy. And so it could be argued that the shift from a diagnostic, analytical, behaviorist, psychodynamic approach to counselling and psychotherapy that happened in the 40s and 50s resembles very much the kind of shift that Paulo Freire is imagining, when instead of being the passive recipients of treatment, we become the active participants in our own personal development. So I think the psychotherapy of the oppressed is a useful way of thinking about how we're going to learn counselling and psychotherapy on our course. In other words, counselling and psychotherapy can indeed be a method of social liberation. Here's a top tip. When in the second semester you start to learn about power and how power operates in society and in the counselling relationship, you could use Paulo Freire as your starting point, because the ideas he talks about can be transferred into the counselling context. I just want to talk about referencing now. It's really important, I can't stress this enough, that you reference all the ideas that you borrow from other people and do not pass them off as your own, which you will do innocently enough, but which, as you go through the program, becomes a more and more serious offence. So let's look at how I'm referencing Paulo Freire's book using the Harvard referencing style and the guidebook that's provided by Edgehill University. Freire, P. 1993, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, London, Penguin. Let's have a look at the different elements of that reference. First of all, we reference the author's name. We start with the surname, and because the reference list is in alphabetical order, the reader will be able to easily find the author looking through the list alphabetically. Notice that the surname of the author is in block capitals. That's an Edgehill University thing. The date is followed by a full stop. The title, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is in italics. And the first letter of the title is capitalized, but the rest of the title isn't. We need the place of publication, and it's always a town or a city. It's never just a country or a county or a state. It's the place of publication, and it's followed by a colon. And then we have the publisher. In this case, it's Penguin, and that's finished with a full stop. And you can find out the referencing details in a book by looking on the page after the title page, and it should have all the publisher's details there, including when the book was published. So for home enjoyment, what I'd like you to do is attempt a critical analysis of chapter 2. I want you to identify the argument that he's making, identify its strengths and weaknesses, think about the evidence that he provides in support of his ideas. Does his description of education match your own experience? And finally, are you convinced by the argument he puts across? You can see that if you're thinking about those questions while you write this critical analysis, you're not simply describing his ideas, you're actually critically engaging with them and testing them and seeing how well they fit your own experience. And that is critical thinking. So thank you for paying attention. Thank you for doing the exercises and for working so well. And once you've done your written piece of work, you can send it to me via email at john.marsden@edgehill.ac.uk, and I will give you some written feedback. Thanks very much, everybody, and I'll see you next week.